Hi, it's Pastor Andy with Wednesday's discipleship video. In March of 2020, the world shut down due to COVID-19. Many different gatherings, most gatherings around the world were restricted. At best, they were restricted. And so most churches did not meet for a period of time. And in fact, as I record this in November of 2021, there are still some that are not meeting to this point. Many people rightly stated at the time that the church is not a building, it is a people, and that is absolutely correct. And really, it was that way, that understanding was the principal understanding for centuries until the German word Kirche really began to confuse the issue a little bit, just several centuries ago from here. So it is possible to be so it is not possible for a church to be without people, but it is possible to be a people as a church without a building. Likewise, a building can be constructed and it could be called a temple, but if God is not present, then can it truly be a place of worship or sacrifice? One of my favorite stories in the Bible is found in 1 Kings chapter 8, and you can also find this in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. It is a story that begins with the dedication of the temple, and the priests who are there that day are taking the Ark of the Covenant, which for the Israelites, since they had been delivered out of Egypt, that had been the presence of God. It had represented the presence of God, and on this day, as with Solomon as king, the priests are taking the Ark of the Covenant for the first time into the newly constructed temple. And when they get it into the Holy of Holies, into the most holy place, they set it there. And as they are leaving the building, the glory of the Lord reveals Himself. He shows up, in other words. And it says that the glory of the Lord came upon the temple. 2 Chronicles says that it consumed the sacrifices and such. But 1 King 8 said that it was so intense that these same priests, and everybody else for that matter, could not enter in to the temple because the presence of the Lord was so strong and overwhelming in that moment. That new building, that temple, that had been newly constructed and had now been dedicated, had all been done with God's blessing, and His blessing is proven with His entry into the temple. So, let's fast forward now, approximately 400 years to the time of Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel 8, Ezekiel is with the elders of Israel when the Spirit of God grabbed him and lifted him up between heaven and earth. And while he is suspended there, the Spirit shows him another vision about that same temple. But the images that Ezekiel saw, that God wanted Ezekiel to see, were not of the same fashion, were not of the same type that had happened some 400 years earlier. The images that Ezekiel saw were of people who were doing abominations, or we might say were desecrating the temple and desecrating the purpose of the temple in some way. God invited Ezekiel, after seeing that, He invited Ezekiel to look even more closely. And Ezekiel saw idols in the temple with some of the leaders worshiping those idols with the idea, with the mindset that we're in the inner rooms, God cannot see us here. Again, God invited Ezekiel to look even closer. Now Ezekiel saw the women who were weeping for Tammuz, who is the god of fertility in and around that general region. But still, God wanted to show Ezekiel even more. So He showed him the steps to the temple. He showed him the entry to the temple. And there were approximately 25 men standing right at the entrance to the temple with their back to the temple, looking out to worship the Sun, S-U-N. So by the time we get to Ezekiel chapter 10, Ezekiel's vision was now that God had had enough. God was removing His presence from the temple. The greatness of the scene that I just described from 1 Kings chapter 8 was now completely reversed as God would be pulling himself away from the temple. His presence leaving the temple, meaning his presence leaving the people of Israel. And by doing so, his protection over the people of Jerusalem, of Judah, of the remainder of Israel was now being removed as well. The temple was going to be without God. Now that temple was destroyed just a few years later in approximately 587 BC, but a new temple would be rebuilt. And then in 70 AD, that temple was destroyed by the Romans. But now, today, the glory of God does not reside in a building, it resides in us. The glory of God resides in those who follow Christ because the Spirit of God resides in those who follow Christ. A church building can sit empty, but a person without Christ is empty. However, a person who knows and who follows Christ is filled, much like the temple was filled that day during the reign of Solomon. As Paul wrote to the Colossians, that Christ in us is the hope of glory. Colossians 1:27. If you are not a follower of Christ, if you are a follower of Christ, you are not a building, but you are now the temple of God. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 16 and 17. All believers make up that holy temple because the Spirit of God resides within us. But the questions that we must ask ourselves collectively, and in a moment individually as well, is what are we doing as the dwelling place of God? And how are we living as the dwelling place of God? See, the book of Ezekiel is certainly different than many of the other books throughout the Bible, including the prophets. But the lessons that God gave the prophet then can still help us today. They can still serve as warnings to us today. And this passage in Ezekiel 8 through 10 is such a warning. The people of Israel stopped asking the right questions about what the temple really was and what their response to God should be. The result was that God not only removed His presence, but He ultimately removed His people from the land of promise. We do not have a temple, and the church is not a building. But we must take time to make sure that we get back to, or we get to, or we return to, however you want to state that, we get on the right track. We get back on the right track. So what I would like for you to do is to truly take a few moments and take inventory for yourself. Consider the questions that I asked a moment ago. They're going to be on the screen here for you to think about. Pause your screen or write them down or whatever. They'll be on for a couple of extended seconds for you in just a moment. But because before we can talk about the we, how are we doing, we must individualize that and ask, how am I doing? If you don't like the answer to your question, and more importantly, if you don't think that God likes the answer to that question, it's up to you to make the changes. So again, the questions, to make individual first. What are you doing as the dwelling place of God, if indeed you are a believer? How are you living as the dwelling place of God?